Hello and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. You thought that I'd be wearing tights because it's Renaissance, right? No. I did even better though. I got a guest for us today. So I'd like to introduce you all to Niccolo Machiavelli. Is that the way you pronounce it? In any case, I thought that instead of doing a full lecture today, we'd do an interview, because as long as we got Machiavelli here, he can just tell you what he thinks about things. So, Machiavelli, you want to just jump into it, or? Doesn't seem to be cooperating. So, back to the lecture idea, I guess. You realize if we do this, I'm just going to put pictures over your head. You don't seem to mind. Okay. So, Machiavelli. Machiavelli, as we said last time, was a Florentine Renaissance thinker who was looking to classical sources in order to articulate an alternative ethic to what he thought was in the society at his time. He was worried that the ethics of the time had become too restrictive, too limiting for people to actually do what they needed to in order to protect themselves and live lives that were secure against other people coming in and taking their land and such. Now, Machiavelli starts out by saying, look, there's basically two types of people. There's your nobles that are basically greedy and ambitious. And there's your peasants, your lower class, which are more populous, but for the most part, they're lazy. They don't feel like doing anything. And this just leads to a whole bunch of conflict in our society. And so we need something stronger than these moral leaders that, say, Thomas Aquinas had been talking about. We need leaders with something more. You see, the problem, Machiavelli says, is that we've been paying attention to imaginary things. And by this, you can think about Plato, who started out with his republic that he knew could never actually happen within history. Or Aristotle even, with his aristocrats ordering society and having their practical wisdom. But he's also critiquing Christian figures like Augustine, who imagined a time before the fall and a time that we would eventually achieve after the fall. Or perhaps also Thomas Aquinas, who's thinking that there's a leader who understands, grasps, and applies the natural law to the world. All of this, says Machiavelli, is imaginary. Your classical virtues that you've been talking about, your goodness of people, the ability to habituate these people into fulfillment, right? None of this is real. And here he actually would overlap a little bit with Augustine, at least in as much as Augustine says that those perfect societies are always outside of history. Machiavelli and Augustine share some of their realism. So what do we mean by realism? Well, that means that they try to focus on the hard realities of life. They're not going to start by looking at the ideal society and trying to remake it here. Rather, they're going to start by looking around them and seeing what is actually going on and then trying to figure out what's possible given my own context. So for Machiavelli, those utopias, those moral visions of the world that others have put forward, they aren't real. What's real is power. And this will be central to Machiavelli's ethic. What's real is power. And if you want to be a leader, you ought to pursue power. Because having power over people is the only way that you're actually going to be able to lead them effectively. This idea shows up in Machiavelli's treatment of prophets. Now, prophet is kind of a strange term for what he's talking about, because we usually think about prophets as figures that have received a message from on high, from God, and they come down and deliver it to the people. But Machiavelli was not particularly religious, and he wasn't interested in somebody who was dependent upon God. Rather, when he thinks about a prophet, he's talking about a person who comes up with a new vision for society. In the midst of a time when when fortune has given them the opportunity to reshape what's in front of them, they take advantage of fortuna. They grab their fortune and they impose their vision on the world around them, or at least those who are successful prophets do. Machiavelli makes a distinction between armed prophets and unarmed prophets. And he gives a list of those armed prophets, which includes the figure Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Great was an emperor of Persia who is identified with expanding the Persian Empire. And this is one of those people, says Machiavelli, who had a vision. They were given the matter of their own society and they imposed upon it the form that they saw as fitting. And so this is the armed prophet. But there are also unarmed prophets, people who come up with visions for society that maybe make a little spark in reality, but they are unsuccessful because they don't understand that they need to impose it upon society. They don't have the proper virtues to actually take over control of other people and have the power to put their vision in place. Here, Machiavelli gives the example of a friar who had lived in Florence by the name Savonarola. Now, Savonarola, when he had seen the rise of the Renaissance and the fact that Florence was leaving behind its medieval Christianity, he was greatly disappointed in the morality of the people who started to look to these pagan sources. And Savonarola had, for a very short period, led a revolution that kicked out the Medici family, which was the most powerful family in Florence. And he attempted to establish a theocracy, a standard of Christian goodness, which would be shared around the community and which would establish a new Florence. Now, the Florentines were Renaissance people. They weren't excited about what they saw as a kind of repressive view of life Savonarola was selling. So, after a short period of time, Savonarola himself was picked up and he was burnt at the stake. Now, Machiavelli uses this as an example of the contrast that he wants to play out between armed and unarmed prophets. Why was Cyrus successful in expanding his empire and leaving his print upon it? Because Cyrus was an armed prophet, whereas Savonarola wanted to bring about goodness without force. He wanted to bring about a new society without paying attention to power first. And that kind of thing will get you burnt at the stake. So Machiavelli draws his general conclusion: all armed prophets have been victorious, and all unarmed prophets have been destroyed. Now, this might seem to you a rather radical claim, and no doubt it would even to the Renaissance people of Florence. There's one obvious case in which you might want to question this, and that has to do with an unarmed prophet by the name of Jesus. So it seems that Jesus has had a lot of influence on society, right? I mean, Western society wouldn't be what it has been if it hadn't been for this Jesus guy. And Jesus was not associated with power. He was certainly not an armed prophet. So what is Machiavelli doing here? Well, Machiavelli's claim here is as much normative as it is descriptive. He's not just telling you about history. He's telling you about what kind of leader you need to be. Because if you want to be victorious, you're going to have to bring your arms along with you. Now, this also tells you something about how Machiavelli thought about religion, because he doesn't seem to give it much credit on its own. As a matter of fact, he thinks that religion should primarily be used by the good leader in order to gain more power. You probably could have guessed that by yourself. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Now, Machiavelli, in offering this picture of the leader, is doing something fairly new in Western society. He has a picture of the leader that is really a self-made leader. This is a leader that's not created by a particular society. As a matter of fact, he says the leader is given that opportunity by Fortuna to place their own will, their own shape upon society. So it's not the society that primarily shapes them. But neither is this leader like Augustine's leader, a leader who is ultimately dependent upon God. You see, Machiavelli's leader seems to be a leader that can create society ex nihilo, that they can create out of nothing by a sheer act of their will. If they are heroic enough, they might be able to create something great. And Machiavelli is trying to encourage them to go after that. And this is really new, and it represents a kind of middle position, eventually, between the classical thought of the socially structured self and the modernist picture of each individual starting out as their own, as kind of self-made people. Machiavelli doesn't go that far. He doesn't imagine that everyone in society will be a self-made person, but he does think that true leaders should aspire for this. And he thinks that perhaps if everyone in society had a little bit more of this in them, you might be in a better position. Now, this goes along with Machiavelli's prime virtue, which is an alternative to the classical virtues, the virtue of virtù. And if that sounds strange, it's because it's a mess in the English language. So, if you recall, the Roman virtue of virtus was the virtue of manliness. And Machiavelli, in calling for people to have virtù, is drawing on his own Italian heritage, running back to Rome. Focusing on this virtue brings us back to the question that Aristotle asked. Is the good leader a good human being? Now, you recall when we went through Aristotle, Aristotle answers that positively. And by that, Aristotle is emphasizing that the good leader is really the only one who has the opportunity to be the fully good human being. Because ruling is a practice that is part of eudaimonia, that's part of the fulfilling human life. And so Aristotle says, yeah, the good leader is really the only one who could be the good human being. While others are expected to have all the rest of the virtues, the good leader is expected to have, in addition, the political virtues of leadership, which kind of round everything else out. But you can also take that question in the reverse order. So, do we expect our leaders to live up to our general moral standards? Now, here's where Machiavelli goes differently than Aristotle, because he suggests that no. At least if we mean the classical virtues or Christian goodness like humility and caring and compassion, he says, no, we shouldn't expect the good leader to be the good person. If there is any such person as the good person, the humble person, the peaceful person, they will only be allowed to live such a life because the true leader who is filled with virtù has provided them a society in which they can. Now, at this point, we'll say something about Machiavelli and women. It's not promising that Machiavelli's primary virtue can also be stated as manliness. And this starts us down the road towards an understanding of Machiavelli's approach to women in general. Machiavelli does use some examples as he's going through of women that are positive, kind of women who took control. But they're not usually political leaders, they're usually political outsiders. And what he says specifically about women is not incredibly positive. As a matter of fact, when he talks about things that you shouldn't do to people, he says that the leader shouldn't make them hate him. We'll come back to that in a minute. But he says the leader shouldn't get people to hate him. And in order to stop people from hating him, a leader shouldn't take a person's property away. They shouldn't take their wife away. Now, if you notice the eliding of those two, you might notice that he just treated women basically as property of the men in the society. This would go along with a generally Roman picture of the paterfamilias, that person with virtus, who's in charge of the family, right? And everyone else falls below them. He also has this metaphor of fortuna, which I've mentioned. So fortuna is, on the one hand, fortune. And he uses Lady Fortune as an example. So those great leaders are always given their opportunity by fortuna. So they will be able to grab hold of their own society in times of crisis, in times of war, when the society is itself falling apart, or when people are utterly in need and broken. These are the times that Fortuna opens up the possibility. And Fortuna, at those points, he says, you ought to grab hold of her. And as a matter of fact, he makes things a little bit worse by saying, Fortuna is a woman. And so you must grab hold of Fortuna and beat her and submit her to yourself. So this is a metaphor, but you gotta wonder what a guy who can say this actually thinks about women. So again, I know this is getting to be a little bit of a broken record, but man, women get screwed throughout the history of political thinking. Only in modernity will we ever get past that and then into post-modernity. So hold on, we'll get there eventually. All right. So you can see in this, even going so far as to talk about grasping Fortuna and beating her, that Machiavelli is letting loose of something inside the human that is not at all what Aristotle or Plato would have thought about as the true human at all. As a matter of fact, Machiavelli is open about this. He says that true leader who follows Virtù will know when to let loose his beastly nature. He'll know when to go forth and torture other people and kill them, even if they are innocent. The human being lives by law. Remember Thomas Aquinas? So the human being lives by law, but the beast is free of law. And the true leader will know when to let this beast out. You can think about Plato back with the Ring of Gyges, who suggested that if you started doing evil when you had the ring on, that your conscience might get more and more tepid until you lost track of what it was that you used to think was good or bad. And if you found any happiness at that point, it would be the happiness of a beast, not the happiness of a human being. And for Plato, this served as an argument about why justice was better than injustice. And Machiavelli comes along and he says, well, that might be true, but if this kind of injustice is the only way to dominate society, then you have to let the beast loose. This brings us to the famous question which Machiavelli addresses: would you rather be loved or feared as a leader? There is a classical answer to this, articulated by Michael Scott in The Office. Would I rather be feared or loved? That's easy. Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. But that's not really a classic answer, and that's not Machiavelli's answer at all. In order to explain the relationship between fear and love, Machiavelli, at one point in The Prince, tells the story of Cesare Borgia. So Cesare was a ruler who took control of Romagna, which was a province around Florence in northern Italy. Now, when he took control, the area was largely chaotic, and the people were not entirely receptive to his leadership. So Cesare Borgia decided he had to do something about this. And he went and got a man named Ramiro de Urca. Ramiro de Urca was known for his cruelty. And Borgia told him, look, I have a job for you. I need these people put in submission. And you go out and you do whatever you have to do in order to bring that about. So Ramiro de Urca went out and he tortured people and he killed people and he laid waste to villages until the people finally submitted to the ruler. And at that point, Borgia looks around and he sees the destruction that's come about. And he thinks to himself, you know what? De Orca has done a good job, but in the process, he's gotten a lot of these people to hate him. A person loves you when they value your presence, your leadership. They think that you are a kind of great person. So love would overlap with something like honor. A person fears you when you can take something away from them. And so they accept your will because they don't want to lose that. But if we move beyond that, we move to hatred. If you take away enough from a person, that person will decide they don't have anything left to lose. And so there will be nothing stopping them from rebelling against you, from deciding that even if it takes their life, it's worth it to destroy you. They will be filled with vengeance and take that on. Well, Borgia looked around and he said, a lot of these people, they seem to hate De Orca. And so something needs to be done about this. So he made a decision. He comes into one of the large cities and he puts on a trial. He calls people from all over Romagna to come and testify against De Orca for the horrible things that he's done. And Borgia overlooks and listens to this as if he's a just judge all day. Well, that night, the people go home. And when they emerge the next day, they find in the common area of the city, De Orca, who has been split in half with a knife, and the two halves of his body are set at different points in the town square. The knife that has cut him in half, covered with blood, and set beside the body. And Borgia emerges, and he says, I have brought about justice here. And Machiavelli says, the people were struck, amazed, and in awe. Now, this Machiavelli means to put forward as an example of that great statesman, that person with virtù, and that person with prudence. Because Cesare Borgia has figured out how to subdue people and at the same time leave them both loving him somewhat because they look at him as this man who has brought about justice, who has destroyed this person who brought terror to them, and at the same time afraid of him because he sent a message with this action. Look, you don't want to cross me because you know I'm capable of everything he was capable of. And so Cesare Borgia is a person who has somehow mastered being loved and feared at the same time. If you're a truly great statesman, you might be able to do this. But Machiavelli is not convinced that everyone will be as good a statesman as Borgia, at least good statesman in the sense that he thinks of people being good statesmen. He doesn't think that everyone will be able to achieve this balance of love and fear. Borgia took hold of Fortuna and did a wonderful thing with it. So Machiavelli concludes, if you can only have one of love or fear, it's better to be feared, but don't go so far as to be hated. Now, why feared over love? Well, it's because Machiavelli believes that people are more motivated by fear than they are by love. So let me give you a more mundane example than Borgia. Imagine that I teach at Central Methodist University, a small liberal arts college, and I love what I do. I love the students that I see or the camera that I look at when I make online videos. I love doing this, right? It makes me very happy to do it. But down the road, there's another college, and they come along and they offer me twice the money that I'm making in order to go teach for them. Well, how much will my love affect me in making that decision? No, I'm moving. I'm going, taking the more money. But now let's modify the example a little bit. What if it was the case that the president of Central Methodist University had it in with the mob? And I should be clear at this point. I'm not making any claims about the president of the university or the. I mean, I could get in trouble for that if you know what I mean. No, I'm not. Anyway, If the president of Central Methodist University had it in with the mob and the president came by and said, "Hey, I hear you've been offered another job at that other university." He says, I understand that you're thinking about taking it. He says, I've heard that at that other university there tend to be accidents. People's kneecaps go out, if you know what I'm saying. Wouldn't want that to happen to you. Now, at that point, I might think twice about going down and taking the job at the other university, even though they're going to offer me more money, right? So which was the stronger motivator for me? Was it my love of CMU or was it my fear of the president, right? So Machiavelli says it's your fear, because fear is in fact a better motivator. We shouldn't assume that people are actually so good that they'll be overwhelmingly motivated by their love. Now, another aspect of the Borgia story is how it gets us into the importance for Machiavelli of appearance as opposed to reality. So Cesare Borgia appeared to his people to be, in some sense, a just ruler, because he went and he took out the unjust person who had been torturing them. But if we remember back a little bit in the story, it was actually Borgia who, knowing the person he sent them in to do exactly that. Now, Borgia was not then actually a just person, but he put out the appearance of a just person by overseeing the trial, by listening apparently attentively as the people put forward their claims against De Orca. He made an appearance of goodness. And Machiavelli thinks this is important because appearance is itself a source of power. You can control what other people think of you. You can gain power over them by doing that. So the leader doesn't internally need to be a good person. As a matter of fact, they need to be that person who can release the beast, who can in fact torture and kill even innocent people when necessary. But to the extent possible, they should keep their outward appearance as a person who is good and virtuous in the classical ways, and even someone who is devout, a Christian who follows after God and all of the natural laws. You see, again, religion is only important inasmuch as it's useful to the leader to channel that into centralizing power and maintaining their leadership. Now, up to this point, I've been focusing on all of the kind of immoral elements, or what the classical figures would have seen as immoral elements in Machiavelli's thought. But there's a point at which we should probably back up a little bit and say something more about the morality that he does expect of the leader. Because while he's been talking about a leader who's free to do all of these different things, he doesn't believe that the leader ought to just do those things for the heck of it. If a leader just enjoys going out and torturing people and does it for fun, that's not the kind of leader that Machiavelli has imagined. You see, for the leader, power is not the ultimate end. Rather, Machiavelli imagines a leader who will use that power in order to impose a particular kind of order on society. And here again, we can go back to that virtue of virtù. So you remember in the Roman Republic that virtus was the virtue of the paterfamilias, who was in charge of the family. And that was the virtue of manliness, bravery, and such. But it also was a virtue that obligated them to take care of those who were underneath them. They had particular duties to their own family and even to their own slaves. So in some ways, Machiavelli is still following out that kind of Roman picture of the paterfamilias that he's trying to implement in this new context. So what are the duties of the prince? Well, Machiavelli lays out 4, and they aren't extreme duties. He's not picturing a leader who will organize society to habituate people to their own fulfillment and eudaimonia. He's not claiming that they should in fact order society justly. All of that is still imaginary. But he does say that the leader will bring about order in society. will bring about stability in society, and will bring about safety for the members of the society. Again, we can think back to Rome and its disciplined military, which brought about the Pax Romana, in which everyone under the empire, while they had to obey the will of Rome, they at least experienced peace. That you could go back and forth throughout the empire with little fear of being attacked by brigands or by barbarians, because the Roman army, for the most part, kept stuff stable. Now, the last of the duties of the leader might seem a little bit further along. And again, this is a kind of middle point as we're moving from the classical to the modern. We haven't focused a great deal on liberty thus far, although it would have been around even in Rome. And it's unclear, I think, exactly what Machiavelli has in mind here, whether he has a kind of classical notion of libertas, or whether he's leaning more towards a modern conception of individual liberty. So I'll interpret him more in the Roman vein. So liberty was primarily the liberty of a people. It was the liberty of a people to be that people and to be safe from the incursion of other peoples into their territory, destroying their identity, taking over. As we move on through the Renaissance, we also develop a picture of more modern liberty, the liberty of the individual to be who the individual wants. But Machiavelli doesn't have to go that far to say that the leader has the duty of providing liberty. Because he might mean just that, the liberty of the people as this particular kind of community, as the Florentines, as the Romanians. We are safe from all those who are outside. All those other princes of Italy, they cannot attack us. And at this point, we ought to say something about means and ends in Machiavelli. This is some technical language, but you've probably heard of it before. So ends are the things that you're aiming at, and means are what activities or things you use in order to get those ends. So you can imagine that if I were hungry, right, my end is to get some food, and as a means to get food, I might walk and make myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and eat it. So those are the means of my achieving something. But there might be multiple means that could work in order to achieve some end. Or I might have multiple means that I want to try out. So for instance, if one of my daughters is acting poorly, I might try, in order to correct them, the means of talking to them, rationalizing with them, saying, okay, here's why this activity, this behavior is unacceptable, and would you please change what you're doing? Now, maybe that would work. That would be a very kind of classical, virtuous way of doing it. But if you know children, probably not. So then I might go to other means. I might punish them. This would be the more Machiavellian way to do things. I might punish them. I might send them to their room. I might send them off to Siberia for, well, I probably won't do that. But, you know, it's fun to think about every once in a while. So there might be multiple means that you can use to achieve a particular end. Now, Machiavelli has these as his end. He believes that the leader will need power in order to achieve these particular ends. So in that context, power is a means to fulfilling the leader's duties. But what can a leader do in order to achieve power? Well, at that point, Machiavelli basically says the leader can do whatever the leader has to do. The only limits on it are whether those means are effective in bringing about the end of gaining and maintaining power. Now, we could say that the ends justify the means, but for Machiavelli, I'm not entirely sure that this is right. Because Machiavelli doesn't entirely vindicate those means by the fact that they bring about a good end. He doesn't mean to say that those means become good because they were necessary. As a matter of fact, he tends to say, no, you couldn't actually be using the beast. You seem to be doing bad things to achieve a good end. This seems like just something you have to accept. So don't pretend that it's good, just accept. All right. Now, the last thing that we should qualify with regards to Machiavelli is where he thinks the prince should locate his power base. So if we go back to the beginning of the lecture, you'll remember that I said Machiavelli thinks there are basically two types of people. There are the nobles, who are extremely greedy and ambitious and will make trouble. And then there's the peasants, those common people, who for the most part are lazy. I mean, they hang around, they do what they have to do, but they're not incredibly well motivated at all. Where should the leader place his own power base? Should the leader try and line up the nobles because he figures they have the most power, perhaps they have the most knowledge, they'll be the most helpful to him? Or should the leader go to the more popular audience, the broad swath of peasants? Well, Machiavelli's answer here is somewhat surprising, at least if you've paid attention to most of classical thought. So Aristotle would clearly say, oh no, you should go with the nobles, right? I mean, the nobles are those with higher educations. They'll be better at this. They're kind of better people than your average poor. And goodness knows, you don't want to get the poor into a position of power at all, because they might take over things and that would lead to a democracy, which would be chaos all over the place. But Machiavelli actually turns things kind of on their head here, even from the picture of Rome. So he's breaking away from a whole tradition in doing this. He says, no, you wouldn't want to place your power base with the nobles because the nobles are the ones who are ambitious. They won't be steady because they'll always be trying to figure out how they can take advantage of you for their own, right? He says, you can't trust them at all. He says, you know who's more trustworthy are the peasants, the common people out there. Because as a large number of people, you can actually get them on your side. And then the nobles will have to pay attention to them because the nobles will always be worried about an uprising if they come into disagreement with you. He says, in some ways, the great number of people are more constant. They are more reliable than those nobles. An idea that would have struck classical thinkers as just crazy. This decision on Machiavelli's part has raised questions to people after him about whether Machiavelli was really telling us about the prince, or maybe if he was trying to encourage princes to move in the direction of republicanism, or maybe even some form of democracy. Now, either way that we read Machiavelli on this, he's being Machiavellian. Because if he in fact means this just straightforwardly, it seems that he's saying, look, the peasants are perhaps more easy to manipulate than those aristocrats, those nobles. And so you can weaken the nobles by going to the people directly and attempting to establish a popular base for yourself. So on that reading, he wouldn't be in favor of democracy. He would just be finding another means to gain the leader power. But the alternative, which several readers of Machiavelli have followed, that he was actually laying out this time a kind of trap for the prince that would lead to the development of republics and democracies as the people gained more virtue and came to threaten their own kings and their own princes. Well, that would be supremely Machiavellian, because he would have written the entire book, The Prince, basically lying to us about what his purpose was. He might actually be trying to trick the prince into doing something that will eventually bring about the prince's downfall. So you can choose which one of those Machiavelli is. Maybe it's not either one in the extreme, but something of a mixture. Before leaving Machiavelli, I want to say something about Machiavelli's method, because Machiavelli makes his case primarily by citing examples that are in situations of emergency. Situations where you're in the midst of a war, or a society collapsing around you, or where people are desperately looking around for anyone to take control. Machiavelli's leaders work perfectly for these contexts, because the ability to step up and take control is exactly what is possible in those moments. As he himself says, these are opportunities given by fortuna. But Machiavelli seems to be suggesting that this is the basis for an overall political ethic. that this kind of narrative should shape the activity of leaders all the time. So there's another couple of options that we ought to look at here. One is that Machiavelli is really just overestimating the extent to which this political ethic is useful. Maybe it's the case that most of the time a kind of common or classical morality would work for the leader, even if in emergency situations the leader needs to go to extraordinary means in order to save or create their own society, right? So maybe Machiavelli is just wrong about this. But another way to read Machiavelli is to suggest maybe Machiavelli actually knew what he was doing. And he's suggesting that these emergency cases are the places where it's most clear that politics is like this. But politics is itself always like this. Maybe in more subtle ways, maybe in ways that the public doesn't usually recognize, because they can only see the appearance. Okay, all of this said, let's wrap up by putting Machiavelli into some of those themes that we've talked about for the course. So, human nature. Well, actually, it's a little bit problematic to put Machiavelli in the category of human nature because it's not clear that he articulated a human nature. Machiavelli is interested with a particular time in history and a particular culture. So when he talks about the nature of peasants as lazy and the nature of nobles as greedy and ambitious, it doesn't seem that he's laying out an overall theory of human nature. And this might be part of Machiavelli's charm, is that he refuses to do so many other moralists have done in putting together the claim that they actually know what all human beings are like. Even in talking about the virtue of virtus, Machiavelli says, well, this is what we need now in our society. He says maybe Christianity and Christian virtue was necessary at some time because those Roman virtues had become too prevalent and they had become too shaped by virtus. But he does think that this is what needs to happen at any particular time. So take what we say here with a little grain of salt in that I don't think that he's describing all of humanity. He does seem to think that human beings are not capable of pure virtue or living in a purely virtuous society. Here he overlaps with Augustine. People are more motivated by fear than they are by love. This does seem a general claim by him, but don't go so far as hate because people will turn against you. And people are perhaps deluded. They like to see their leaders as good and virtuous, even if no true leader can live up to that. Social and individual. Here, again, there is no general claim that Machiavelli makes. He doesn't claim that individuals are all self-created. He doesn't claim that all individuals are made by their society. So we'll focus more particularly on his picture of the leader, which we've seen. Prophets or heroic leaders are capable of what appears to be ex nihilo creation of social order. They are self-made, taking advantage of the opportunities provided by fortuna. They make themselves leader by the force of their own will, and they put the form of their own will upon the matter of society that is given to them. People and property. Material goods, like all other things for Machiavelli, are to be used by the leader in order to maintain power and fulfill her or his duties to society. This means that the leader is free to give or take property in whatever ways are useful. So the leader can basically manipulate property and the property of anyone in order to be loved or feared but never hated. And those are the only rules that seem to apply for Machiavelli, at least at this time in history. Equality or inequality. The leader is free to use people in order to gain and maintain power. Machiavelli is especially dismissive of women, treating them as the property of men and suggesting that, like Fortuna, they exist to be tamed. Now, it's not clear what all in this is supposed to be a kind of natural hierarchy. As a matter of fact, the place of the leader seems to be shaped by the will of the leader and whether the leader takes hold of that place for themselves. Okay, the shape of government. Well, Machiavelli assumes the rule of the prince is the proper form of government, or at least this work does, because he's giving advice to the prince. However, he says the prince should have a power base among the more populous lower classes. And so some have interpreted this as a Republican or Democratic vein in Machiavelli's thought. Whether that's true or not is up to the interpreter. The purpose of the government. Here we find the duties of the leader to provide order, stability, security, and liberty. So this is definitely less than the ancient Greeks had pictured for society, and it overlaps, although perhaps even is a little bit more pessimistic than Augustine had imagined, as Augustine had thought that there could be cities that would rise to the point of love of knowledge. And what authorizes the leader? Power gained and maintained through virtù. This does not authorize the leader morally, but practically. So Machiavelli, as opposed to the other figures that we've talked about here, is not as interested in what makes a leader authorized in terms of morality, although I suppose if you were to ask him that, he would say that it'd have to be a leader who fulfilled the leader's duty. But he's more interested in what you have to do to make yourself a leader. So what authorizes the leader primarily for Machiavelli? It's actually gaining power and actually submitting the rest of the society to your will and your power. So that's Machiavelli. How'd I do? Is that generally what you want to answer? Any questions at the end here? I'm never having him on again. All right, until next time, see ya.